This is the second video for Year 12 history students at Torpoint who are looking at Britain between 1625 and 1701. And this continues the theme of the background to what's going on in Britain and what happened really under the Tudors. And this video looks at the economy and population and gives a sense of what kind of jobs and what kind of country England is at the time. The economy of England at the beginning of the 17th century was overwhelmingly agrarian, farming based and pre-mechanised. The vast majority of people are working either in the production of food or in industrial raw materials like wool and leather. With any kind of agrarian economy, it's highly vulnerable to natural disasters like droughts, excessive rainfall, or outbreaks of epidemics, things like plague. There was permanent underemployment. This is caused by the seasonality of work in a backward agricultural system and the inability of this form of productive activity to produce constant or continuous employment. To an extent, people were compensated for by part-time employment in the domestic cloth industry, but this was also irregular and subject to disruptions. What we have got at the beginning of the 17th century is a high infant mortality rate, a low average expectation of life at birth, most people are looking at the upper 30s, and a relatively youthful population. Nearly 40% of people living in 1600 were under the age of 15. This is quite different from what you might expect to see today in a country with a backward economy. It had a low dependency burden. That means it doesn't have a very large number of population who are dependent on others. There aren't too many who are too young or too old. Most people are working. The typical family, though, is a nuclear family. Husband, wife, and 1, 2, or maybe 3 children. Relatively small families. Couples don't also tend to get married until they're able to set up their own independent households. So they need to be earning, they need to have some kind of regular income. The economy of England is also quite commercial. Despite its agrarian base, despite being based on agriculture, it is dealing with national and in some cases international markets. And so you do see examples of people who are ambitious and entrepreneurial and risk-taking. In the early 17th century, England had been greatly affected by market forces that were influenced by a long-term rise in population and a long-term rise in prices. The key sort of factor there is the increase in population. And there are a number of reasons why the population was increasing so quickly. Although outbreaks of plague were getting rarer, and they would still hit towns, the number of outbreaks of infectious diseases like influenza, smallpox and typhus were less common during this period. So the population is obviously going to increase. There does seem to be a change in fertility patterns, though. There seems to be a drop in the average age of people's first marriage and a drop in the percentage of people who never married. People at the time were very aware that they were living in an age when the population was growing quickly. And all major sectors of the English economy was going through changes as people attempted to adapt to the new circumstances of rising prices and growing demand. The 16th century saw population move into a much rapid state of increase. For those in fixed or limited income jobs, there was great hardship and poverty. Wage labourers, people working in farm labouring for usually quite small amounts of money, suffered a lot. And cottagers, people who rented out their cottage long term from the landlord and worked the land as well. So although that bottom end of society struggled, the top end actually found it quite tough too. The great landlords and the aristocracy were also affected. They tended to lease out land for rent, but they did it on very long leases, and so didn't have the ability to increase the rent to offset the increase in prices. For those people who owned their own land, though, population and price rises posed an opportunity. Food production and profits increased, new land was taken into cultivation, and the growing wool trade encouraged the development of sheep farming as a highly profitable enterprise. Yeomen and merchants were able to grow rich enough to purchase landed estates and move into the ranks of the minor gentry. At the same time, some of the independent peasantry slipped into the class of wage labourers, so there is a movement amongst the social classes going on. This does bring an increasing gap between the rich and the poor, and that leads to problems of vagrancy and popular unrest. And by 1603, when James became king, the worst problems of vagrancy and unemployment were being brought under control by a system known as the Poor Laws. Look at the changes in agriculture. Those are probably the most important of all. They're not obvious and easy to spot because they tend to be very slow and very undramatic and concern such wonderful, exciting things as crop rotation and manure. But they're very, very important, perhaps more important than other economic changes that were going underway at the same time. Three major ways of increasing agricultural production were attempted during the 17th century. The area of under cultivation was extended by deforestation, so transforming woodland into farmland, draining waterlogged land, and taking into cultivation marginal land, sloping land, rocky land, and so on. Attempts were also made to increase output from land which was already under cultivation, mainly through enclosure, which was the systematic fencing off of large open fields. These new enclosed fields were then divided into smaller fields which were allocated to farmers. This gave them much more effective use of land. You tended to get far less wasted land or unused land. There was also a system in place called up and down husbandry, which is a rotation system in which arable farming was periodically alternated with pastoral farming. So 1 year of growing crops, 1 year of letting cows or sheep graze on the land. This ensures the soil's fertility because it's maintained by the manure of the animals that are kept on it every other year. There were also attempts to increase the size of the sheep population, and farm size was increased by a process known as engrossing, which is quite simply amalgamating several small farms into a bigger one. In terms of manufacturing, there is some evidence of enterprise and innovation there as well. The vast majority of manufacturing, though, is still done in people's homes and in a rural setting, usually as part-time occupations. This is known as the domestic system. So merchants would bring cloth to people's houses for them to work on in the evenings or during the winter. Typically women would spin cloth and men would weave it. This is a very flexible system. It doesn't tie up money in building huge plants or factories, and it does enable entrepreneurs to respond to sudden increases in demand. The outstanding example of domestic system success was the production of woolen cloth, which was the country's major industry and was centred in the West Country, in Cornwall, and also in East Anglia. There was overseas trade going on as well, particularly in the well-established trade in woolen cloth to Northern Europe. But English merchants had been very enterprising in developing new trade routes. They'd begun to trade with Southern Europe, the Mediterranean and the Baltic, but also they were opening up new trade routes to the Far East. The East India Company was founded in 1600, and they were also starting to look for colonies across the Atlantic. The first permanent English colony in America was established in Virginia in 1607 and was called Jamestown. There were some threats to the economic stability and strength of England. There were some significant weaknesses in the structure of the English economy. There were big limitations on the ability of English farmers to actually increase the output of food. Deforestation was expensive. Drainage of waterlogged land was costly. And farmers found it very difficult to increase the fertility of soil. The only real way to do it is to leave land fallow, like this up and down husbandry system. You leave it fallow for a year, or you let animals graze on it, or you spread manure on it. Unfortunately, the supply of animal manure is limited by the inability to increase the size of the animal population because there are no real fodder crops. There's also a dangerous dependence on a woolen cloth. It is the most important manufacture in England, but that does mean that all of your eggs are in one basket. If something happens to the production of the woolen cloth or the transport of woolen cloth, the whole industry is going to fall down because there isn't really a backup product. So overall, how fragile is the English economy at the beginning of the 17th century? The weaknesses ensured the English economy was afflicted by a series of serious economic crises. It's periodically going to be hit by harvest failures and is vulnerable to trade crises. But there's a danger of exaggerating the fragility of the economy. It was an economy that was commercialised and advanced enough to stave off the worst effects of famine and starvation that afflicted far poorer and more backward countries in continental Europe, but also closer to home in Ireland and Scotland. So that's the economic picture that we're looking at the start of the 17th century. This is an agrarian, agricultural economy, but it's relatively stable. It is making some improvements. We have got some industries going on at woolen cloth. There's money to be made in England, and it's a far wealthier country than, say, Scotland or Ireland. Thank you very much for watching. Please use this video to support your other notes.